Today, I want to talk about business, teamwork, standards of excellence, communication, and management. If I were to sum that all up, today we're simply talking about why certain companies succeed while others fail, flounder, or just do mediocre. Now, I think this is a very fascinating topic. It's very relevant to anyone who has a career, usually, because regardless of whether you're a nonprofit or even a business, most organizations depend upon systems and teams to succeed. And so it could very much help your career, it could help the success of your business or organization by just taking a more active, thoughtful approach to why do we do things in a certain way and how can we help ourselves succeed or fail if we don't do certain things. And a lot of people never take the time to do this. They just go through the motions. They have a job, they do the job, and they never take a moment throughout their entire life to wonder, well, hold on, what could we really be doing better critically to improve our business, our organization, and succeed? Now, of course, many listeners are already kind of self improvement focused. So, of course, they're going to care about it. But I'm speaking to the general world when I'm picturing people who don't uh, have that thoughtfulness. So, to really illustrate this idea, I have a story for you. So, and this is a story that really got me thinking about this in the first place. A few years back, I was working for a fancy fine dining restaurant, and the clientele was fairly well off. I was your standard worker there, so I did everything from busboy to waiter. Now, before we can really explain the story, we have to kind of briefly explain some of the process to delivering food and ordering food. So, when you sit down at this restaurant, it's similar to most restaurants you would think. You get a menu, the menu might be different from day to day, depending on the special of the day, but most of the stuff from week to week at least is the same. And from there, you can order what you want, just like a typical restaurant. A waiter or waitress will come to you at some point. You can flag them down sometimes, but usually they'll see you, and then you order your stuff and it arrives. There's also a dinner menu and a wine menu. Nothing crazy. However, there's a couple small tweaks to this to kind of amp up the, I guess you could call it fanciness or customer service. And that's important because customer service is critical to this story as well as critical to any business's success. Even, nonprofit wise, if you're having a horrible time donating or doing something, people are not going to do that. So really it's the crux to business success in certain ways. Now, this basic mechanic that makes it a little fancy is that when people order their food, what they don't know is happening is that the waiter or waitress will write down a number that corresponds to their seat. By doing this, the busboy who delivers the food will know exactly which dish goes to which person, and it gets served out without any type of issues. Versus, a regular restaurant where that person would usually bring all the food and then start calling out names. And then people would say, oh, that's mine, and then they take it. It's really not a huge deal, but it is a slight elevation for elegance and service. Now, you wouldn't think this would matter much, and arguably it doesn't, right? People at a restaurant, I've never seen anyone get upset or even notice the difference when a waiter does that. They're just like, oh, that's my food. You called my dish, that's what I got. Never in the many times I've been at a standard restaurant. However, for the purpose of the story, that actually had an impact. So, as I mentioned, the clientele are fairly well off, and one of them got fairly upset because he got the wrong food delivered to his table. Now, the kicker in the story was I was the one who delivered the food. So, before we go any further, let me just kind of break down how the table is set up. So, usually they're square tables. Sometimes they're rectangular, and then it's just a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 numerical system, starting with one edge of the table. And it was just arbitrarily denoted that the, I would say, northeastern table was the one that was one, and then you would count clockwise after that. Unfortunately, many of our employees get that confused, and that was the case here. Essentially, I got the table set up correct, and the waitress was the one who had marked it wrong. Now, why was this customer so upset? Well, it had happened not once, not twice, but numerous times. And as a paying customer who's spending a large portion of money at this restaurant on a consistent basis, that is not good. And so, on top of that, we have a situation where I'm the one seen at fault, or at least we're in a situation where the customer is upset and blaming the organization. So, what happened here, and how can we bring this into a thoughtful discussion to discuss some of the ideas and thoughtfulness of excellence in the organization? Well, we'll tie it into some of the principles and tenets of successful businesses and brands soon. But I'll tell you what I did to respond. First off, the man got very upset. He's like, "Why does this keep happening? I work in data analytics, and this is something I fix. How the heck does this keep happening?" It's very frustrating. And he basically blew up at me while his wife was there. I calmly responded by saying, "I'm sorry, sir. This was human error, and I will talk to my manager and make sure the system gets fixed." At the moment, I said what I did because I thought that I didn't want to throw my waitress under the bus and point fingers, because I thought maybe she would dislike me if I did that, and it would just be unpleasant for her if she had to bear with that. And so he said, I told him this, he kind of calmed down, and we moved on with our day. I went back to my managers immediately, and they were kind of busy on the computer. So I told them, and they said that they would handle it. I got the sense, and based on their behavior in the past, I got the sense that by handle it, they've meant that this was a boo boo, and they were just going to go back to this customer and say, "My apologies. Here's a free dessert or free meal as a condolence." Now that's a good thing, but it got me thinking: will this solve this issue in the future? Has the system actually been fixed, or will this continue happening? And I believe that the system would continue happening. See, that's because I also went back to the waitress, and she was a veteran. She'd been there many years. Uh, Unfortunately, while she was very agreeable and friendly for the most part, and somewhat industrious most of the time, she and many other colleagues there had a certain level of indifference. When I told her specifically, "Hey, this man got very upset. He said this isn't the first time it's happened. Hey, I think seat one is actually over there. You marked it wrong on my receipt." I even said it nicer than that because I didn't want to blame her and say the blame. I didn't say you marked it wrong. I probably said something like, "I think this might not be the right seat for seat one." And she just responded with pure indifference. She was like, "Eh." And then she went back to, I believe it was playing on her phone or something like that. Now, keep in mind that many of the colleagues there have been working there for many, many years, and uh, we're working close to minimal wage jobs. So ultimately, has the system been changed? And in effect, it was not changed. The process would probably continue into the future. This waitress, although she works there often full time, she probably only got this guest a portion of the time. And this guest had to deal with all the other minimal wage workers there, some of which were not as vigilant with memorizing the seat schedule and the seat rotation, which would lead to the same problem in the future. While a gift like a free dessert could potentially ease tensions temporarily, ultimately it's just a band aid on a problem that really requires some medicine or a cure because it's going to continue happening into the distant future. So that's quite tragic. This man's probably going to get a little happy, and then we're going to take a tiny expense to kind of appease him for the moment. But probably it's going to happen again 2, 3, or 4 times in the next year until the point maybe he stops continuing business with us completely. And that's just going to be quite the loss because, first off, that's going to be a huge hit to profit because of the amount he spends. But on top of that, in the grand scheme of things, how much of an expense was that free dessert compared to fixing this system? At initial glance, that free dessert seems like a costly expense, but in the long run, fixing the system could in fact be a higher impact event that would eventually cost the business less. So now we can dive into employees, cultural values, and systematization. Let's start with employees, specifically hiring and training and firing. Now, in minimal wage jobs, it makes me wonder, how well can the standard of excellence be? When you have these companies that are literally paying their employees as little as possible, how could you possibly expect a higher level of excellence, attention, or care for their customers and so forth? As we counterbalance this idea with real companies, we realize that maybe despite that, you can still accomplish a lot from the profit margin standpoint. There's countless franchises that fall into this category, from Starbucks to Panera Bread to McDonald's to Burger King to KFC. Despite that low level of quality in terms of hiring and training talent, they are still able to generate multi-billions of dollars. So the question really becomes, does hiring quality talent matter? And I would argue yes, but more so from a managerial standpoint. Unfortunately, I think these companies, while chasing the big dollar, have also kind of lost in certain ways in terms of just general brand and quality perception. We've all experienced at least one horrible customer experience at a fast food restaurant. I myself have experienced a few as well. Even though my parents were immigrants, I've had a lot of frustration, but I also respect that, you know, there's immigrant coworkers out there, but I've had frustration with immigrant workers at minimum wage customer service franchise jobs that can't speak a lick of English. It's been exceptionally hard for them to fulfill a basic order when I would go to Kava or Kadoba. And unfortunately, it's a drop in customer service. Yet they still hired them. They still managed to run this business, and ultimately they're still making considerable profit. I would argue that hiring good people still has a very vital role, even though based on what you've seen so far in terms of examples, it may not seem to on the outset. And that's because we're highlighting big brands that have such a good system and product that they can make up for in minimal wage level service just by sheer volume of franchise locations. On the flip side, we have Mark Zuckerberg, founder, CEO of Facebook, who has spoken on a record numerous times that he spends up to sometimes more than 50% of his time on hiring. That's it. Out of all the tasks he can do, out of how busy he is, he spends 50% or more of his time hiring and interviewing potential candidates. He truly believes that the power of good talent really makes or breaks a company. Similarly, if you look at Good to Great, one of the most best selling, widely respected books in business, also highly acclaimed and almost seen as uh, a Bible for Jeff Bezos, one of the tenets in Good to Great as a book, which does a very scientific analysis of successful companies versus unsuccessful ones, is to get the right people in the right seats on the bus. Essentially meaning that you have to hire the right people, you have to fire the wrong people, and then you have to get the right people into the right jobs in your company. So based on that book, we do have a important hiring decision, and that is a huge important role to the success of a company. Now, this all makes natural common sense. How does it relate to my story? Well, think of it this way. That employee showed a level of indifference to the role there that was probably going to cause ripples into the future in terms of the success of that customer's relationship with the restaurant. Unfortunately, it was somewhat swept under a rug. So was hiring the issue? Should she not have been hired? That's a good question, and I'm not going to leave it up to myself to answer. I'm simply posing that thought out there. And the answer may be no. You have to expect a certain level of indifference and poor quality given the wage you have to work with. Moreover, if you look at a well respected brand such as Chick-fil-A, they are able to maintain a high level of customer service so much that many people have remarked on it, despite the fact that they're paying slightly above minimum wage for their jobs. And so the question, based on that real world demonstrated performance, is maybe not so much hiring when we're talking minimum wage as much as systematization in terms of training, spreading of cultural values, and maybe even a little emphasis on hiring to make sure these people will embody those cultural values and be willing to work at a near minimal wage level. Chick-fil-A's done it at a great level, and ultimately it may simply come down to cultural employee training. I've talked to Chick-fil-A employees, and they said one thing they get for free when they join is a book on customer service. The book gets bought for them, and they get to read it, and that simple focus and emphasis on it can make the world of difference. So that points back to the power and importance of managerial roles. Now, again, I'm not trying to point blame, and it's just one story, one instance out of an entire life experience of these managers. So I'm not trying to point blame anything, but what are the managers at fault here? Did they fail to bring up a system? And more so, in terms of organizations and businesses in general, how can and should a manager oversee systems and changes so that things work seamlessly and fruitfully? Ultimately, we can do the best we can. Hiring and training, we've already covered. A manager is in charge of that, but also larger strategic positions and terms and and they have some emphasis on the system. Now, systems make or break many organizations. McDonald's, for example, thrives because they're so consistent and everything about their product and their service is consistent across the country, the world, because of their system. Ultimately, it's all in the books and they follow what's in the instruction manuals. And so every McDonald's looks the same, which delivers a certain level of expectancy to the customer that builds loyalty to their brand. That's very hard to do. And so one could say that everything comes down to a system. Maybe if we were scheduled from the get go to have a more memorable seat configuration system that was hard to screw up, we could avoid those customer complaints. And really, no matter how much a manager or another coworker tries to influence or complain or yell or demand or positively reward someone to get the right seating setup, ultimately, it's the system that's going to last the longest and have the greatest effect because as soon as that manager leaves that job or as soon as there's a dip in prioritization of that field from the manager, there's going to be a problem because we all know the turnover rate in these industries are very high. And so there's always a new generation, a new flood of employees coming in who have not heard the manager complain and emphasize that one element much. And so one could argue that the system may have the highest level of importance, but that's not to say that every single part of it is not important. Hiring, managing, and systematizing, because the manager, especially if they're high up enough, is the one who, when they do their job right, can oversee on the horizon any potential problems and switch and change that system to fix those problems. They can also set themselves up to be the collector of information from their employees. Obviously, it's a hard job, and one can only try their best and hope for the best. So I'll leave you with a few final examples and business tenets. And I think the whole idea here is to get your mind thinking and to actively consider ideas, not so much to draw any hard rock black and white conclusions, because that's not what this is about. It's about thinking and coming up with your own answers. So in terms of other systematizations, let's move away from the minimal wage model and look into more higher end products and employee wage scales. Google, owned by the holding company Alphabet, may be an example. Another example would be maybe Louis Vuitton, Gucci, or if you don't even want to go that expensive, Apple. Or if you want something more boutique and not so mainstream and mass market, how about something like Auntie Anne's, which is a privatized but highly successful pretzel franchise company or pretzel chain. I don't think they're a franchise. Or we can just go to your standard stores, your standard mid-market service levels companies. But you get the idea here. There's these companies that I've mentioned all generally have a higher level of average employee salary. And sure, some of them have somewhat of a minimal wage occupation. Apple, of course, because of their size, of course, they're going to have people working their stores that are just salespeople, or as they call them, geniuses who kind of work the store for IT help. But in general, many of these companies don't really have a minimal wage worker, except for maybe the janitors. The bulk of their force is made up of fairly well compensated, well taken care of employees, and uh, usually they're engineers or programmers. So then, what ends up happening in this type of business model, when you really, really care about hiring, as they do, I've heard Alphabet, Google will go through up to 6 or 7 rounds of interviews with different panels before they bring someone on. And you have to pass through all of them. They really care about getting the right hire. Well, then, ultimately, do you get a higher level of success? And it seems like the answer is yes. I mean, Alphabet has been one of the most successful companies to date, and they invest a lot in taking care of their employees, even offering buffet meals, daycare, and massages for their employee campus. On the flip side, how much is values and excellence and attitude a part of it? If you don't know the right things to hiring the right person, then how could you really say it's good hiring? You might think it's good hiring, but you may be looking at the wrong criteria. Many people make up their own criteria when it comes to what makes a good hire. They just assume that what they think is good is good. But what if it's not? What if someone cares, whether they admit it or not, about how attractive someone looks to hire them? Or they really just care about how many Ivy League degrees that person went through, or how good they can do the job, not how friendly they are to others. Those can all affect the decision and be subjectively good but objectively bad criteria for hiring the right person. And then there's those implicit biases, those biases we would never admit or consciously be aware of, but things like racism or sexism that do still seep into the data, the numbers, when we look at things in terms of job interviews. So ultimately, that's a topic really for an entire book. There's plenty of books on good hiring, including Good to Great, which was already mentioned. But ultimately, we do look at these strong core values that many companies focus on. And these core values are something that we should really consider when it comes down to good hiring. One of them is just a high standard of excellence in what they do and what others do. Perhaps if that waitress was hired based through that screening filter, they may have been screened out and we could have avoided that issue, but maybe not. How could someone even really screen for that when people can lie? When people can say, yeah, of course I have high values. And so that's another criteria, a little addition to the system of job interviewing that also needs to be considered. How can you force that out of them? One way is for people to ask people to tell stories. Someone can tell a story of a time where they did do that, where they did hold themselves and others to a high standard of excellence. Great. If not, if they're struggling to, that's a bad sign. Or maybe you get references. You interview those references about their experience working with that person. In terms of Amazon.com's list of leadership principles, there's over 10, and they've really helped Amazon become one of the most profitable companies in existence. Off the bat, the first principle is customer obsession, and that's something that also could have been screened through that waitress and could have ended in a different result. Ownership is another one of the principles, and invent and simplify is another. So just realize what you can do, how you can do that, and ultimately you'll make the best decision. Oh yeah, and hire and develop the best is actually another one of Amazon's principles. So in that vein, it's almost saying, ironically or coincidentally, that one of their principles is hiring, which is almost a double whammy. So think through what you care about, and we'll go from there. Hopefully, this podcast episode got you thinking. Please feel free to tweet me or write to me. Just go to willyoulaugh.com. There's a contact form, and then there's links to my social media in my footer. Let me know your thoughts. What do you think matters most? Is it the system, the hiring, the leadership? Is it all of the above? Is it something else? And then what are your thoughts into this topic? What can be improved? What can be changed? What do you think leads to a high bar of excellence at an organization. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe. Please leave a rating. Really helps this podcast out. I'll see you later.